I get to skip the counter and pick my car as a Gold Plus Rewards member. Sign me up for that!
Producers, if you struggle finding sounds and samples that work for you, then you have to check out this plugin. It's called...
Want to have a working spaceship in your game? Hello y bienvenidos! In this video we will create a flying vehicle by using the assets found in Kitbash Mission to Minerva Kit. You will learn how to use the Unreal framework in order to board the ship and give it commands. To animate the ship, we will use a component-based approach mixed with some logic, instead of rigging it and animating each action. We will create the ship movement and mechanics inside blueprints, and not only that, we will polish said mechanics by using clever camera tricks and VFX. This tutorial is a great example of what you can achieve by using third-party assets. So if your goal is to become a better developer, I encourage you to watch until the end. With that said, let's start! Let's start by downloading the asset. To click on the spring arm, it gives us that. You can drag and drop. Immediately know that I need to land. So I can solve this again in a multiple different use controller. Rotation job is the orientation of the box should really depend on the forward direction of my ship collision box. So let's just get forward vector, put it in the orientation, and let's make my ship take off from land again. So now my trace really depends on the orientation of my box. So when this collides with thing, what I want to know is that it's actually land. Now, instead of using the visibility channel, what you can do is here in the project settings, go to collision and create your own trace channel. For example, ship land channel. For now it will be block, and let's say that I do not want to land on top of a cube here. I'm not that I'm using. I'll reset the location. Idea to take in consideration. What's this? Works correctly. I don't need to modify it, and I'm not looking at the back, at exactly the back of the ship. So yeah, this is the value that I will move it. How am I moving things? Well, you know it. Whenever we land, I want my, let's put a track, and I will be using the vertical movement alpha because it reflects the, well, vertical movement. So here I will add the spring arm. Oops. Spring arm, set relative location. I only want to modify the C value. Interpolation. Oh no, not interpolation, this is an alpha, so let's just use LERP, linear interpolation. The starting value is, now I have a first person character, and this first person character I'm going to put it as my default phone. First person character. Let's compile, save. And the thing about that first person character is that I will be looking at its hands constantly. Where is it? There is state. Yeah, and I don't necessarily want that. So for now, want to have a working spaceship in your game? Hello y bienvenidos! In this video we will create a flying vehicle by using the assets found in Kitbash Mission to Minerva kit. You will learn how to use the Unreal framework in order to board the ship and give it commands. To animate the ship, we will use a component-based approach mixed with some logic, instead of rigging it and animating each action. We will create the ship movement and mechanics inside blueprints, and not only that, we will polish set mechanics by using clever camera tricks and VFX. This tutorial is a great example of what you can achieve by using third-party assets, so if your goal is to become a better developer, I encourage you to watch until the end. With that said, let's start! Let's start by downloading the assets from the kitbash3d.com webpage. In my case, I'm going to use the Mission to Minerva one. You can browse around and see if there are more assets that you would want to use. But in this tutorial, the one that we're going to use is the Mission to Minerva one. And because there is a contest going on right now, price is 0, but if you're watching from the future, don't worry, we have some coupon codes for you that you can use in the entire store. So go to the 3D software and choose Unreal. And let's just search for camera. I could create
Welcome to the Quick Start Guide for setting up your first ad campaign with TikTok Ads Manager. If you haven't
another axis mapping, but an axis mapping already has a value associated with a key. So right now, if I want to put my W key here, I can search for it. Now let's get worried a little bit about the fact that this ship needs to land and it needs to take away. Let's try it. Let's compile. Now whenever I press W, wherever I'm looking, I'm going in that same direction. Now I need to change this logic for my but I have this. I want if we like. Now inside the project, search for the folder.
hard, bro. This is different. Finally. There we go. We figured it out. So we can't have bones. Okay. So I should be able to go back here. Nice. I need to make a quick open world real quick. gonna go bonkers. Or I can't collide with it.
So, you're finally ready to launch your dream business as an LLC or limited liability company. You'll be able to set.
Hello, and welcome back for another video. And we're going to take a look at Legend. Then concave objects like mesh here is essentially just a duplicate of the object and found for your door. You're going to create collision from. Alright, so but if you were to use complex collision for this, it would essentially double the number of verts that are being called for this object, right? So instead of 2,000, it would be 4,000. And so by turning on complex collision, you're going to be doing that essentially for every object that you have it enabled for. So let's make a proxy mesh for this object that is very low poly that we can use as our collision mesh. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to name this, and this is actually an important part of the process. You want to give this a name which is fairly specific. I'm just going to call this bridge, and there is a reason for that, which we're going to come back to in a second. And then we're going to create our collision mesh as a separate object. So for the bottom here, I'm just going to let's see here. I'm just going to draw a new one. And one thing that I like to do when I'm creating collision meshes is just give them a different color. You can do that by adding a material. It doesn't matter, it's not going to save this information, but just so that you can tell where you've made collision and where you haven't. It's not a big deal on something simple like this, but if you're making something complex, say you're making like a house that has, you know, doors and stairways and a whole bunch of other stuff in it, then you want to be able to tell where you've made collision and where you haven't. Alright, so this is our collision mesh, so everything that's in green is going to be our collision. And the reason I've made it out of separate parts is because, of course, simple collision can't do, you know, concave shapes, but it can do convex shapes, and you can have multiple of them. So this collision setup for this is going to be made up of 3 different shapes, and this is how you get the concave shape using simple collision only. And this will work for doorways, this will work for bridges, it'll work for pretty much anything. Now, in order to get this into Unreal Engine, you need to tell the software which parts of this mesh are actually static mesh and which parts of it are only going to be used for collision. And that's pretty simple to do. The way that you do it is with the naming convention. And the reason that I said that we should have a very specific name for our object is because if you have lots of objects in your scene, sometimes you want to make sure that you are having separate names for each object, which are unique identifiers, because you have to use the specific and exact name for the collision boxes. So if I were to use, see it says bridge, if I were to use bridge_1 or bridge with a capital B instead of a lowercase b, then your collision won't work. It has to be exact. So the way that you do this is you go UCX_, and then the name of your object. I usually just copy and paste it so that I know that it's going to be exact. And then _01, and you can add as many numbers to the end of this as you want, and it will load. So you can have multiple different collision boxes. So I'm going to do that for these other cubes. So this will be 02, and this one will be 03. And the names are exact, so it has to be exact. So if this is bridge, then this has to be UCX_bridge, and then the number. And that's really all you have to do in order to get your collision set up. So let's go ahead and export this as an FBX, and then we'll import it into Unreal Engine. And so the way that you would do that is to select everything, because you want to make sure, different people have different export settings for their static meshes. But when I'm exporting an FBX, I usually have this selected objects only turned on. So you want to make sure that you are definitely exporting your static mesh and also the other components with it. So all of these will be in one FBX file, essentially. I'm just going to save this on the desktop and call it collision example.
In this video, I'm going to show you how to build the most interesting, fun, yet simple Python project that you've ever seen. Now, I know that's saying a lot, but what we're going to do here is build an AI choose your own adventure game in under 100 lines of code. Now, I'm going to walk you through step by step, and I promise you, even if you're a beginner pro.
All right, so now back in the engine, we're going to import this. And to do that, I'm just going to open the content creator and drag this in. And let's have a look now at the settings. So on our import settings, the one thing that we need to make sure of is here where it says generate missing collision, that's turned off. And it's because we're importing our own collision, we don't want it to generate anything. I'm also going to tell it not to create materials because this object doesn't need any materials. So you can see that it imported our static mesh, and the collision meshes that we added to this are not visible here. So they're not part of the object. You can see if you look at this here, that we don't see those objects anywhere. And it's because they were converted to collision.
Folder Mission to Minerva, go to Actors and search for the ship. And let's drag it to the map. And you will see that the
So if I
meshes
go
also
up
need
here to show simple collision, you can see that it is using that collision mesh that we created as the collision mesh for this object. And down here in your collision settings, under collision complexity, it'll say you have a couple of different options here. Some people say use complex as simple. Don't do that. We're going to use simple collision as complex or leave it at project default. Use simple collision as complex is fine because then what it's going to do is it's just going going to use a little bit. You can see that we can now walk through it even though it is concave, and our collision is working on all sides where it should be. So we've managed to make our collision for our scene over 2,000 polygons.
Hello everybody, and as well, but let's say this is your mesh and we're just going to open that mesh and then we're going to go into its collisions just to have a look. Now I've got it set up as block all, use complex collision as simple, and then this is the mesh that I've loaded in to tell us where the collisions are. If we double click it, we can see the actual collision. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not exactly low poly, this can be optimized even further, but this is sort of the shape that Unreal Engine is going to read to use as a means to block your character as it progresses through this world. Now, if we go over into our mesh and then we go into show and select simple collisions, this is what Unreal Engine would give you as a simple collision. If we use this, your character will obviously be blocked by these areas. So if we actually change this to simple, so project default will go to simple collisions. If we now go into the world and start playing again, you'll notice that we have an issue with our collisions. First of all, I can walk through some of this stuff. As you can see, there's nothing actually blocking me from walking through some of the meshes, because this is what simple collision does. It just calculates an overall shape of the object, but it clearly doesn't do a very good job at interpreting it very well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into these files over here, just so we can have a look again. If we switch over into use complex collisions as simple, then it's going to load the complex collision mesh that I put in, right? So how do we create this? That's the question. And this is where Blender comes in. Now, what I've got here is I've got a copy of that mesh, which, by the way, you can see that it's got individual bricks and so on into it. So I've got a copy of that, and I have now got it into a state that I can use as a collision. So we're actually going to do that very quickly, just so I can show you, and then we'll load that into Unreal Engine, and then you can see how that's actually being used. Okay, so this is the mesh that we've got. As you can see, it's got about 602,000 faces. Because I'm using this as a nanite, I don't really care about the poly count, but we obviously can't use this as a complex collision mesh, because it would just destroy our performance at this level of faces. Plus, I don't think Unreal Engine would even be able to cope calculating the collisions based on this amount of polygons. So what we want to do with our mesh, that we're actually, this is the same mesh that we've got over here, literally the same one. What we want to do now is go into a modifier in Blender and just add a decimate modifier. Now, you don't need to know how to use Blender to do this. Literally, when you open Blender, this is what you're going to see anyway. So this is, you just got to be on this option and add a modifier as a decimate. Now, you'll leave it to collapse, and then you're going to set this number to 0.1. And what this does, it will take your entire geometry and basically sort of collapse the geometry on itself, so then it has a lot lower polygon count. So right now it's got 100,000. We're then going to apply this modifier, because now we can add a second decimate modifier, and again we'll do that to decrease the poly count even further. So again, click over here, select decimate, whatever it's called, and then do another 0.1, and this takes to 10,000 polygons. Now, if you're happy with this, then that's fine. You can already see how the shape has changed over into these areas while doing this. So you can see that they're not exactly square, they're a bit triangular. So you may want to go to maybe a 0.3, which then gives you a better shape on that. And again, you can apply that modifier over into these areas. Modifier. We're then going to add a decimate to do with our nanite. I don't really care about the poly count, but we obviously can't use this as a complex collision mesh because it would just destroy our performance at this level of faces. Plus, I don't think Unreal Engine would even be able to cope calculating the collisions based on this amount of polygons. So what we want to do with our mesh, that we're actually, you know, this is the same mesh that we've got over here, literally the same one. What we want to do now is go into a modifier in Blender and just add a decimate modifier. Now you don't need to know how to use Blender to do this. Literally when you open Blender, this is what you're going to see anyway. So this is just got to be on this option and add a modifier as a decimate. Now you'll leave it to collapse, and then you're going to set this number to 0.1. And what this does, it will take your entire geometry and basically sort of collapse the geometry on itself, so then it has a lot lower polygon count. So right now it's got 100,000. We're then going to apply this modifier because now we can add a second decimate modifier, and again we'll do that to decrease the poly count even further. So again, click over here, select decimate, whatever it's called, and then do another 0.1, and this takes to 10,000 polygons. Now if you're happy with this, then that's fine. You can already see how the shape has changed over into these areas while doing this. So you can see that they're not exactly square, they're a bit triangular. So you may want to go to maybe a 0.3, which then gives you a better shape on that. And again, you can apply that modifier and then again add it once more and then go to a 0.2. Again, that's too much, so you may want to take it to a 0.5. 0.5 still not enough. 0.4, yeah, 0.4 looks to be even better. 0.3 too much. 0.35 again too much. So 0.4, apply again, and let's try it one more time. Decimate, let's go for 0.4. You can see that it's literally destroying the geometry too much. And again, you can manually do this, so I'm gonna leave it at 0. I'm gonna leave it at that setting. You can do this manually, but imagine doing a manual collision for a mesh like this. This would be insane. Now, in a environment where you're making a game or whatever you're doing, you wouldn't want collisions in areas where you're not actually going to use it. So what other people would do, they would just create simple collision around the areas around this base and the platforms themselves, maybe separate the geometry in such a way that it's easier to do. But we're just going for a very clean, very quick effect to add collisions to your scene. So we've got that done. Now all we need to do is export the FBX. Make sure you've got selected objects only, and then you export it as whatever name. I generally put a UCX at the end or at the front of it just so I know that it's a collision. You press export and that's basically done. Once the export is done, you go back into Unreal Engine, and now you can open you can bring the content browser again. I'm in Unreal Engine 5, so control space will bring that up. I've got myself a folder specifically for mesh collisions. Now this is that particular collision that I had earlier, but this I've already made a new one, so I can right click this one, select re-import with new file, and then I can select the new the new mesh that I've exported as a collision, which is this one here, and I'm going to press open. This obviously will re-import the mesh in here, which is fine. Now if I go back to my tower and open it, you can see that it's already using that, but let's just for argument's sake, let's just take it off, and we say we definitely want to use complex collisions as for our project. We don't want to see any simple collision, we just want to see the complex collisions. I can then type in the name of the collision that I just brought in. Sorry, that was tower. So there it is, UCX tower destroyed. I can then click it, and now you can see how the collision has been calculated, and Unreal Engine is now seeing every one of these objects as a collision point as well. So again, if you go back into the game, that's already done. Very interestingly enough, you can actually right-click the collision, go to Nanite, and enable it. And obviously, this, because it's such a small mesh, this applies Nanite quite quickly. Now let's just play from here and just see if the collision works. And as you can see, it does. Now, this is very nice because with Nanite, you ensure that your collision mesh is actually quite efficient. So I don't know if this was an intended thing from Epic, you know, if they actually wanted to have this done, but it's very nice because even though you obviously overspec on the collision, it was quite high because you're using Nanite, and enough, you can actually right-click the collision point as well. Real Engine is now how it is. UCX tower destroyed. I can then click it, and now you can see how the collision has been calculated, and Unreal Engine is now seeing every one of these objects as a collision point as well. So again, if you go back into the game, that's already done. Very interestingly, interestingly enough, you can actually right-click the collision, go to Nanite, and enable it. And obviously, this, because it's such a small mesh, an open folder.
Some demo in that night. Let me see.
Specifically for mesh collision, export, and so we've got. You're not actually going to see it as literally this. So you wouldn't want collisions in areas. We're just going for a. Make sure you've got selected objects only. Make sure you've got selected objects only, and then you export it as whatever name. I generally put a UCX at the end or at the front of it. You press Unreal Engine. Unreal Engine is done. You go back into Unreal Engine. You can space. We'll bring that up. But this I obviously will get off, and we say we definitely want to use complex collision. I just brought in. Sorry, that was tower.